So the first question, just kind of going in order, is from Joe, who said substitute teacher, one of the districts in which I worked, 86'd me or fired him for revealing that he had TS. What are my recourses? A couple of things, Joe. One of them is that you do have the opportunity to seek legal counsel, or you can file a state or equal opportunities, or excuse me, equal opportunities commission claim, and that's a little bit more informal and easier to do. But certainly, I don't know what state you're in, but there should be some options for you. There are, I don't know how long ago this was, and you don't need to put that into the chat, but there are some issues with how long ago it has passed and the circumstances around the firing, that an attorney or someone would have to work through that. So the bottom line for Joe is that there are legal recourses to challenge that decision. Whether or not you will be successful, that depends on the merits of the case, and it's a very complex thing, but that's why it's a good idea to seek legal counsel. In addition to the EEOC and legal filing, there may be some state law Human Rights Acts complaints that you can file as well, and some of those do not need attorneys. Okay, I'll note that while I am an attorney, of course, I cannot give legal advice during this presentation. This is really for informational purposes, and that's because there are a number of important rules for lawyers to follow, and each situation is different from others. So we can't get into enough specific details, and I am probably not licensed to practice in the state that you're in. So that's really why this is for informational purposes. So encourage you to seek out an attorney in the state you're in. The state's protection and advocacy organization are often good resources. Okay. Turning to Edward's question, he posted a question, or Edward posted the question about, what if a job manager knows that I have Tourette syndrome, TS, and works at a minimum wage job, and the physical stressors of the job made my symptoms worse, which was addressed, and that I addressed it needed to be intellectually challenging instead. They would not change my job title because they said that cannot be, because my TS was the reason, and I needed to stay in the physically stressful position. And Edward also added, physical limitations was my limitations, not intellectual. I told my former manager that. That is a very complex question, as I'm sure you know, Edward. From a legal perspective, there's a route that the courts or an administrative process like the EEOC would need to go through, whether or not the employer used the TS as a reason to fire you, or to not change the job title, and whether or not you are qualified for the more intellectually challenging job position. And so I don't know if you met the job description for that other job, the more intellectually challenging one, and they refuse to transfer you into that. So one of the areas of analysis that an attorney or someone else can help out with is whether or not you're qualified for that other job, and or whether they refuse to change the job title for the physically stressful position. And it also gets into the inquiry about whether or not, Edward, you could continue with that current job because of the TS. And if they had some adverse employment action, which was described on the screen and on the slides before, if there was that adverse action, then maybe that would be a reason that you might have a legal complaint. Right. Hopefully that helps. The next question that I see is from Anonymous. Did we learn here tonight that coprolia can get someone terminated from a job unless they disclose the disability beforehand? No, I think that's a little bit of an overstatement. The point that I was trying to make on that was that in that particular case, there was an issued about the employee not disclosing the disability at a time before there was the problem. And the employer's defense was that they did not know about the corporalia. And so that they had no reason to make accommodations or no reason to engage in the interactive process. And so it's a couple steps removed and it's a little bit nuanced, but it does make the point that if that is an issue for someone with TS and you know it's going to happen, or you're working with a friend, a spouse, a child, an adult child, might want to have a serious conversation about disclosing that disability during the employment hiring process or after someone gets hired, so that that issue of whether or not the employer knew or didn't know is not an issue. So I hope that helps to clarify. Another anonymous attendee indicates the job position of mine at that past job was creating liability for the management. I wanted to work in a job position with less physical labor, which there were several, but they did not want to accommodate me, even though that the heavy laboring job was causing the liability. Yeah, that's another very difficult question, and it really gets to from my perspective, and again, this is for informational purposes only, that it is really about whether or not the person is able to perform the essential functions of the job. And so kind of the critical point of those slides before is that if an employee cannot perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation, they're not going to be a qualified employee. So if this question were given to me, one thing that I would want to know is what kind of limitations does that heavy laboring job position have, and whether or not the person could do that with or without reasonable accommodations. I see that they did not want to accommodate me, and that raises the question about whether or not the accommodations requested were reasonable or not reasonable. So again, the steps are to look at the essential job functions, whether or not the person can do those with or without a reasonable accommodation, and then look into whether or not the accommodations are reasonable. And that's part of a process. Elizabeth writes, how do I start the conversation with my executive peers? My tics are obvious, but no one understands what's wrong with me. Yep, that's a really important question, Elizabeth. One approach, and again, really consult with legal counsel if you want some more specific legal advice, but maybe for some informational purposes, it might be a good idea to figure out a way to work with a different manager or someone else that can set a time to have a meeting with the executive peers where you could talk about and disclose, if you haven't disclosed either, about what is going on, and to dispel maybe some assumptions or that, and maybe give some information and some ways to more appropriately understand and identify and to positively address what's happening. But I think the critical thing is to figure out a way to get a way to set the structure for that conversation to occur. And maybe if there are materials that you wanted to provide, or if there were different examples that could be provided, but to really think about how the conversation could be structured and everyone knows about what's coming and is in the right place and space to think about this. And again, of course, I can't know all the details about what type of setting this is, whether or not the peers are going to more likely or not to be welcoming of this. And so all these are different things that you should think about and go through before making the decision to do that. But there are some tips if you did want to go through that process. Let me do a time check. I know that there's a number of other questions in the chat. There are 2 or 3 more. But Alexandra, how much more time we have? I see that we're already past the top of the hour.
I think if we can do one or two more questions, that would be great, and we can end there to respect everybody's time.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just choose one at random. I haven't really looked at all of them carefully. Another one is by Anonymous. If someone does disclose their disability prior to starting a job, does this constitute the company knowing a disability exists with the employee, all other things aside? The short and quick answer to that is yes, because once someone discloses their disability, the employer does have knowledge about it. And I think there are two steps to think about. One is that if there are accommodations needed in the hiring process, then that disclosure should give the employer notice that there might be a reasonable accommodation that's required through the hiring process. So that's one. The second area is what happens if a person is hired and that information that was disclosed prior to starting a disability also is important for communication and the interactive process after a person gets hired, and that should trigger the employer's responsibility to have that interactive process to figure out what reasonable accommodations are necessary to do the essential functions of the job. Okay, so I'll turn it back over to Alexandra. Hopefully that helps, and I do understand that those are partial answers, but these are very difficult questions and very heavily dependent on what state you're in, other details and information that are too long to have into the chat. So I'm trying to do my best with the limited information. I know Alexandra and others have different resources, but please reach out to them, as well as consider different legal options or advocacy options as you go through this very difficult and challenging, but hopefully rewarding process. So I'll turn it back over to you, Alexandra, and thank you for you inviting me here yet again to do this live follow-up.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you everybody for bearing with us. We allotted a little extra time so we could really give that Q&A section the time that it deserves. There are all really great and important questions to Dan's point. Like we said before, please feel free to take your phone and snapshot the QR code here to give us some feedback on this program and a brief survey. We really appreciate you being here tonight, and we hope to see you in the very near future at another one of our programs. Thank you for coming. Thank you again, Dan.